Hello, my name is Matt Call. I'm a program manager on the security and policy team inside Endpoint Manager. I happen to be involved with building our unified endpoint security experience, or our unified security experience for Endpoint Manager across the entire plane. So there's members of my team, maybe one or two that are here as well, that dive into different areas, but I'm really focused on the Windows experience, and specifically our integrations with products like Microsoft Defender for Endpoint. So I was hoping what I could do today is talk to you a bit about what our vision is for endpoint security, introduce you to endpoint security if you haven't seen it in the past, or if you're interested in learning a bit more. Encourage you to ask questions, stop me, correct me if I say something wrong, which happens from time to time. And then I want to move forward to what we're doing with our tenant attached scenarios for Configuration Manager, since in my experience, these sorts of groups are pretty interested in the Configuration Manager story, me being a Configuration Manager veteran myself. So without any further ado, I think I'll go ahead and get right into it. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. I'll monitor in the chat, but I'll likely just answer them via voice because I'm a loud typer and that won't work for anybody. Okay.
We lost you, Matt.
Did you lose me? Am I back?
Yep. Now you're back. Now you're back.
Oh, geez. Somebody muted me on Teams. It's probably Jason. Funny business, Jason. I got my eye on you, buddy. So, yeah. So we think about it in a few different ways, a few different pillars. This isn't meant to encompass all of endpoint security, but when you think about unifying endpoint security across your enterprise, you typically think about it, and these are certain attributes, right? It's cross-platform support for your users, right? Being able to take a focus on security and secure a user no matter which platform they log into, whether that's Mac OS, a Windows device, an Android, an iOS, maybe Linux in the future, whatever, right? Like we think about all of those different platforms, but we want to focus around the user because like Jason sort of alluded to in his presentation, devices don't really use themselves. Users use devices, and we should be securing the user no matter where they go the same way. I shouldn't have a different security experience because I'm on device A versus device B, unless there's something specific about device B that requires the configuration to be different, like privilege access workstation, SOS sort of scenarios, maybe factory floor where we want to restrict access because it's a specialty platform, that sort of deal. We also want to make sure that users have the best experience, that they're happy, they get the best performance out of their devices, right? So that sort of folds into this cut down on agents thing, right? We want you to be able to secure your devices without introducing 5,500 new agents, because unfortunately your popularity isn't measured in the number of agents you have on your device, which is unfortunate, but that's not how it works. We also want everything to be secure by default, right? We want it to come out of the box secure, we want it to run secure, and we want that security to be built into the OS and built into the products that we support. So for us, we think about all of these platforms coming together underneath three, there's probably more product sets, but our focus in the endpoint world is sort of three products. Azure Active Directory to provide a seamless cloud identity across all of these platforms and services, right? In such a way that we can secure that identity and have one common identity plane for revocation and control, right? Endpoint Manager to ensure that the device is at the posture it needs to be at to operate on the network, whether that's Configuration Manager, whether that's Intune, whether that's one of the third-party support, third-party MTD supports that we allow to plug into the Endpoint Manager platform to sort of feed this data stream. Endpoint Manager is right in the middle of that, making sure that you're on a device that's managed and is doing what it's supposed to do. And then for those users who like to click on links in their email and introduce sort of quandaries into their environment, Microsoft Defender for Endpoint's there across the stack, both on iOS, Android, Mac OS, Windows, recently Linux, to help detect that behavior, those signals, and help inform Endpoint Manager and Azure Active Directory of devices that need quarantine and devices that need remediation, right? And assigning tasks across, these planes to help ensure that Microsoft Defender for Endpoint, which I sort of will discuss as a sensor probably later, is able to detect and respond to these sort of threats, right? And so that's important, right? So that's sort of how we think about endpoint security as a whole. Endpoint security management, though, which is probably more or less what the team on this call is dealing with, really comprises of some common different areas, right? And areas like antivirus, disk encryption, endpoint detection and response, or enhanced detect and respond, right? Attack surface reduction, like all these different policy areas map directly to controls that we can control on a platform and how we utilize that platform, right? This is sort of like a subset of group policy controls, but only to control security aspects on the device, which is really key. When we take these sort of areas, there's a couple different ways that we can control them. And from the MEM perspective, we have a couple concepts that we've introduced recently, such as security baselines, right? Where we can take sort of a set of tasks, we take a set of settings that we know enterprises want to deploy, like the Microsoft security baseline, preload those, allow organizations to make some changes, and then deploy a holistic security baseline, right? Which is sort of key. Device compliance is around measuring that device. So even though I want antivirus turned on, I want to measure antivirus on that device. And if it's not on, I want to affect the access that device has to resources, right? Conditional access being the gate that device compliance uses to revoke that access. And then finally, with Defender for Endpoint, we have sort of the security task realm where our MDE, our MDE admins can assign tasks or can push tasks from Microsoft Defender to Endpoint to MEM to allow administrators to communicate and set up sort of open items like Adobe Flash is on this device and Adobe Flash is bad, right? So please update Adobe Flash, right? So that's important for us, right? Not so much the the actual task assignment as much as the detection and then the systematic sort of approach to identifying the remediations that are needed on these devices. Because if anything that, quote unquote, modern management has taught us is that when devices start to go outside the wire and when devices start to leave the nice warm enclave of group policy management, they're out in the world. And once devices left the desk, they became subject to a whole nother set of threats. And those threats have permeated in such a way that it's not feasible for humans to crawl through every piece of threat data and determine if there's a threat or not. So we have to use the tools that are at our disposal, which are things like MDE, where we have that endpoint detection response component to sort of filter through all that for us and create actionable items for us to act on, right? Jason used the Windows 10 deployment analogy. I'll just use it again here because it's probably pretty true. Is like, imagine when you were going from Windows 7 to Windows 10, people were like, oh, we need to test every single application, and Microsoft's like, well, it just works. And then, admins or project managers were like, no, not until you get the green light. And as an IT pro, you probably thought to yourself, oh, there's just too many apps, I'll never get it done. So the same way that Microsoft has taken steps through tools like desktop analytics to sort of focus on where you need control, that's the same thing we're doing here with endpoint security management. Is there's a lot of noise, a lot of false positives. We want to help you scope and look at the things you need to look at in order to keep your enterprise safe and secure. So let's keep moving through here. I'll stop for questions in a second. I see them here. So what have organizations told us, right? And this is sort of influencing what we've built in the last 2 years and what we'll continue to build for the foreseeable future, because we really believe that Endpoint Manager and Defender for Endpoint are better together, so much so that our organizations are sort of, like converging. So we believe that simple cross-platform support is key. We don't believe that, admins and tools and separate tools for each platform do a better job. We believe in a lot of organizations, this actually does the opposite. Security professionals and IT pros that need to keep switching panes of glass to manage different platforms usually ends up in some sort of neglect or some miss in a platform. So we want to bring that all together into a single set of controls. We want our policy management experience to be intuitive, right? In Intune, I'll be the first one to admit that in the past, we maybe had different experiences for different policy types, and that's sort of been an issue, right? Different languages in one place or another, right? So, with the settings catalog release that was just announced, that'll come later this year, or come later this month rather, you'll start to see the beginnings of us doing that, right? Bringing together a common policy management platform across all the platforms that we support, right? And that's really key because, Android has different controls than Mac OS, has different controls than Windows, and us having a consistent experience, at least at the platform layer, the Intune platform layer, to be able to distribute those controls is key for us to provide a seamless experience. And then security controls and completeness, right? Like I would say, my boss is here, but like 80% of my job is making sure that there are no gaps right now, right? Making sure that Tenant Attached has no gaps with MDM attached or with MDM policy, and then making sure there's no gaps between MDM policy and GPO. And what are we doing to address those? So you don't have to choose your security level based on your policy distribution mechanism. It's a Microsoft product. We want you to be able to deploy all the Microsoft settings. So that's key. And then they want to be able to continually have devices attest to their state, right? I want to continuously be able to have a device tell me, hey, I'm healthy or I'm compliant. Right? With MDE, we accomplish this with the risk score, right? We have the ability for MDE to consistently check into a device, check in with the service, the Defender for Endpoint service, that it's healthy, right? That, hey, I'm not finding any threats on my device. And as soon as that service detects a threat, Defender for Endpoint combined with Microsoft Endpoint Manager can revoke access to all corporate resources that are governed by conditional access. So like that sort of scenario is super powerful when you think about somebody being compromised. Like somebody's compromised by malware, it's detected by Defender for Endpoint, and all of a sudden Defender for Endpoint tells Endpoint Manager, hey, guy, like this guy's no good. You probably shouldn't let him access anything. And then Endpoint Manager automatically revokes the compliance state of that device, all within a matter of minutes. The round trip on that is like 3 to 5 minutes tops. Right? That's a super powerful scenario for security. And last but not least is it has to be frictionless, right? Like it has to be seamless. We need to be able to have organizations use our tooling in a way that makes sense for them. And this can sort of be a problem because enterprises in general build a process that's okay and iterate on that process over and over and over again until 20 years later, it's a terrible process that should never have gotten to that state, but it's the iterative nature of IT, right? Group policy management in every enterprise is probably a pretty good example of that. I shouldn't say every enterprise. In most enterprises is a perfect example of that. I imagine that somebody on this call at some point has been at a change review meeting and they've reviewed and changed to a group policy. And the question has come up, hey, why is this set like this? And the answer to the room is, it's been like that forever. We can't change it because we don't know what will break, right? So that sort of frictionless, that sort of friction is, we want to eliminate that. And there's a bunch of ways that we're doing that that aren't necessarily presentation worthy, but it's important to know. So endpoint security, outside of everything that I've just noted, also wants to bring together security and IT teams. Traditionally, these two teams have operated in completely separate silos. Security teams have deployed agents, they've built pipelines, they've managed infrastructure to manage security. IT teams have done the same thing. But the end result here is that we have an experience on a device where we have 2 pipelines to distribute policy, 2 agents to manage that device. Well, if we're lucky, we have 2 agents. Maybe sometimes we have 15, right? But we have all of this sort of ease of use and separation of teams that was implemented, quote unquote, really comes down to affecting the end user experience, and a lot of times slowing things like Windows Update for Business and those sort of items, right? Where we need to be agile on the endpoint because the IT development lifecycle, like the software development lifecycle, the SDM is like, it's super short, but these tools that we put in place take long periods of time to either upgrade, be applicable or supported, right? And they really slow down the IT experience for the admins. The other thing that's happening here too is IT teams are learning about things that security teams probably need to know but don't, and vice versa. Security teams learn about threats and things that need to be patched, but maybe because they're dealing with 800 things, it doesn't make the list of the top 3 they need to bring up with IT. Maybe there's a little bit of difference in terms of the policies that are being deployed. Maybe there's conflict. But the biggest difference between these two teams historically has been security teams. Their goal is mitigating risk, and if anybody here is on a security team, they'll know exactly what I mean. It doesn't matter the user impact. It matters that I've minimized the risk to the organization. That's their primary driver. IT teams over the last 10 years have been forced into a much different sort of standpoint. IT teams, their priority is lower costs because IT budgets are cut. It's a cost center, not a profit center. And it's hard to articulate the value that comes from corporate IT teams in most organizations. They're also getting beat up every day about end user experience, right? So when you have two teams that are sort of polar opposite in terms of their roles and their agenda, it can lead to a poor user experience, or at least an unpredictable one at best. So for us, that's why we're thinking about bringing those two together underneath the endpoint security node. Now, it's not enough to just talk about bringing them together. Let's talk specifically about, what Defender for Endpoint entails, right? We talked a little bit about it before, all the stuff that's in sort of the right-hand side here, right? I clicked too fast here. Let me go previous. That's in the right-hand side. We talked about threat and vulnerability management, being able to send that stuff across. We talked about reducing attack surface, things like application and browser isolation. We talked about next-gen protection, things like antivirus, firewall, and we talked about endpoint detection and response, right? And Defender for Endpoint also has other capabilities around auto IR, so automatically triggering investigations and remediations based on threats that you face. And then we also have a service in Defender for Endpoint called Microsoft Threat Experts that allows you to literally pick up the phone and talk to somebody if you're having an issue inside your enterprise. But that's the Defender suite, right? When we start thinking about how they work together, we think about Defender for Endpoint providing that policy assessment from a threat perspective, like, are these devices configured? Are these devices vulnerable? Are there changes that need to be made? And we think about Endpoint Manager enforcing those things. And this slide's awesome because it's got a cool graphic. But anyway, we think about Endpoint Manager enforcing those things and taking action, right? Defender says a device is vulnerable, Endpoint Manager blocks it. Defender for Endpoint says we need to upgrade Flash. We ship a task over through threat and vulnerability management to upgrade Flash on a number of devices, right? So that's sort of how we view those two things. So when we think about that, we think about focusing on sort of these 4 areas where Defender for Endpoint and Microsoft Endpoint Manager can work better together, right? So that's sort of our thought. This is where we see the intersection, if that makes sense. All right, so let me stop here for a second, and let me look at some questions here in the chat. Endpoint security versus device configuration. Is there any chance that policy sets will include endpoint security? Yeah, policy sets we're working to make sure that every policy type and app type is available through policy sets. It's something that we call a horizontal feature in Intune, where we'll need to enable each policy set, each policy type to be quote unquote policy sets enabled, but it's something we definitely want to do. It'll become easier for the traditional policy platforms once we unite underneath a single platform. When Defender detects a virus on a system, how long does it take for the info to show up in the endpoint security AV reports? The endpoint security AV reports are operational in nature. It requires a sync on the device and a summarization. Usually it's within about a day. That it shows up is what we see in most enterprises because of the Intune sync schedules and that summarization, and it's usually within about a day. If you need faster reporting than that, I'd be interested to hear about the scenario, but we really rely on our friends over in Defender for Endpoint land to provide that sort of real-time monitoring. Some of that's limited to the cadence at which we sync. There's no notification. The client doesn't make a notification to Intune when it detects a virus. or detects malware, we gather that data from device at check-in. So our friends in the Defender land alert, report, and investigate those items. So they have much quicker reporting for threat hunting capability. Any plans to add threat overrides and endpoint security AV exclusions like we have in Configuration Manager? I believe that you're talking about the ability to add certain override classifications and the actions that result in them. Right now, it is a gap in MDM, if I remember correctly, because that setting isn't configurable via the MDM channel. We have some work scheduled for the next few months to close that gap. So we should be able to add that there, I believe. If you want to reach out to Frank and get me some information, I'm happy to follow up on that for you and make sure that we can address your need there. Can we access the data shown in the AV reports via MS Graph or other ways so that we can create some scripts and or custom reports? I believe so. I believe it's just a new endpoint. Again, Stefan, if you follow up with Frank, my team can get you the information. We just covered this with another customer, and I believe it's just a separate endpoint. The AV reports are on our new reporting infrastructure, what we're trying to move all of our reports to. That's why you get sort of the rich graphics, the ability to run it on demand, and you get a more complete data set. Once we convert all the reports, they'll sort of look like that. But the AV report, I know that we were able to get that data for a few other customers. So if it's something you need, let Frank know, and he'll connect the dots for us. Okay, here's a build out slide with all the stuff I just talked about. That's how good I am. I don't need to talk about it. But what are the benefits of a shared IT security and management stack, right? I think we talked about this before briefly, but I just want to call it out again. Like, we want to avoid conflicts between IT and security. We want to talk about we want to be able to have visibility between clients for both IT and security. Like, regardless of when their agent checks in or when their client chooses to go online or offline, like, we want the data to come together. We want to remove duplicated agents for the end user, right? If we can do this in a less number of agents, that's a win for, I think, everybody involved. And performance and cross-platform support. Like, that's really where we're aiming at. And of course, integrated value. So now what I want to do is I'll switch quickly to the Endpoint Manager console, and we'll crawl through endpoint security so I can show you sort of what's going on here. So hold on one second while I switch screens. How am I doing on time? Oh, swimmingly. Okay, great. Okay, so if you haven't seen this console before, this is the Endpoint Security Manager console. It's inside the Endpoint Manager all-up console, the MEMAC or the EMAC, depending on who you ask. Most of our admins that use Intune today probably stay mostly in the devices and the apps blade. But the Endpoint Security blade is another area we can go to really do security-focused tasks. Okay, the Endpoint Security blade is governed by an Endpoint Security Manager role. So you're able to, if you wanted to, come into Intune roles and assign just the Endpoint Security Manager role to some admins. That will give them just the ability to access and manage policy in the Endpoint Security node and give them the things they need to do in there. Of course, if you have a higher level role like, you know, Intune Service Admin or something to that effect, you'll still have access to that node. But if you just want to scope it down to endpoint security with a few other items that are needed to run endpoint security, then that's where you would go to do that. The endpoint security node, what you're going to notice is that all these tasks look very security-like. That's the best way to put it. Let me start at in the bottom, and then we'll move up top. The up top usually takes me a bit longer. So you'll see that, you know, versus our traditional Intune policy management experience where you have things broken out by device platform, we find that security admins typically manage stuff by workload. So we have a blade here for antivirus, a blade for disk encryption, a blade for firewall, EDR, and so on. This is where you can configure policy to deploy either to MDM devices or some of these policies to tenant attached clients on-prem today. These policies live in the same spot, right? I always use antivirus as an example because it's our most used policy type in endpoint security by about tenfold. So this is usually pretty important for most people. You'll notice here that I have a couple different security policies all living in the same pane of glass. I have my default Windows 10 Defender AV policy, right? Which is deployed to all my MDM devices. I have a default Defender policy poorly named for the Windows security experience. The Windows security experience is where our tamper protection setting lives. If you don't know about tamper protection, you should be turning tamper protection on across your enterprise. Tested, of course, but tamper protection will remove the ability for people to shut off Defender AV, which is really a huge benefit, especially for customers who are concerned about it. It is an E5 benefit, so something that you need to have Defender for Endpoint enabled on. But we see even customers that are licensed for Defender for Endpoint not utilizing the setting at mass, and that's a real problem. So we need to use more tamper protection, but that's in the Windows Security Experience blade. Then I have an antivirus policy here for Mac OS, and then I have a tenant attached policy going to my Configuration Manager on-prem resources. And I'll cover that in the next section here. Creating a policy should be rather simple. I come into the node like I do everywhere else. I go to create a policy and I select a platform. Today, our platforms are Windows 10 and later, Mac OS, and Windows 10 and Windows Server. This will change as we sort of mature our tenant attach story. Once we have tenant attach across all policy types, we'll look to combine this into maybe like Windows and Windows Server and Mac OS, because the platform doesn't determine applicability. It really just allows you to preload a set of settings, right? Settings that apply to one platform or the other. For this demo, I'm just going to choose Windows 10 and later, and you'll see that I get 3 policy types. I get Defender antivirus exclusions, I get antivirus policy, and I get Windows Security Experience, right? Windows Security Experience handles all the items around, the UX, configuring the UX, and then that tamper protection policy that I mentioned before, as well as probably a few others that I'm leaving out. The antivirus exclusions is a subset of the antivirus policy that includes just exclusions. In the MDM world, we actually merge antivirus exclusions. So if you were going to deploy a single antivirus policy, you could deploy multiple exclusion policies to the same device, and you wouldn't get a conflict. All of that stuff would merge, which would be great. And then Defender Antivirus, which is our core policy for our AV stack. I can come through here and I can give it a name that I'll be able to pronounce, of course, and then I can configure settings just like you'd expect today through the DC profiles. They look a bit different. They're a bit more curated. We've tried to make the language a little bit easier in here, but sometimes it can cause confusion. So if you have any questions, comments, or concerns about those, we'd always love to hear about it so we can become better. But here I can choose all my settings for Defender AV. I'll be able to deploy that. And once I deploy it, that'll be deployed to the Azure AD groups that I specify. I can do the same exact thing, but choose Configuration Manager collections, which we'll get into in a second. Long term, we want you to be able to create a single policy that you can target to both Azure AD groups and collections in the same flow. So simplify that. Remember when I said before, we want to make it frictionless and seamless, like we want it so you can create a single AV policy, deploy it broadly, and that policy will flow to MDM clients as well as the attached clients in Configuration Manager. So that'll be something that we'll work on towards the end of this year, likely, once we get parity. So that's important. All these things are important. So this is sort of the endpoint security node. You can find similar experience for all of these items underneath their blades. And then we have shortcuts here for device compliance, and then to get us over to conditional access as well. So that's important. These 2 items here we find are important to security admins. Down below, we also have the ability to set up a Defender for Endpoint connection. Mine's currently connected. The name should change this month to Defender for Endpoint. This is how I configure that integration with MDE. Once I have MDE, I go into the MDE tenant and say, turn on integration. It's a setting in my MDE tenant. And then I'm able to save this configuration and the 2 start talking to each other, exchanging data for the shared goal of security. Enabling this integration also allows me to do seamless EDR deployment, so onboarding and offboarding of Defender ATP, which is important. It's really important. No more scripts, packages, or whatever else. Once you're integrated, you're there, you're done. It's just a done deal. Like you just deploy the EDR policy. The EDR policy takes care of onboarding the device to Defender ATP and reporting compliance for that policy, which is really a simplified experience. Up top, we have a few different items around security tasks. This is this TVM integration. I think I just closed out my last demo, so that's my bad. But in theory, in the TVM console and security center, I could start pushing tasks over here with impacted devices, the remediation that needs to be done, and be able to allow some sort of tracking between the two tenants. And then security baselines, an area that's near and dear to our heart, where we take these collections of settings and we allow them to be deployed as a group. Key pieces of functionality for baselines are sort of twofold for me. I've worked in a lot of enterprises, so I'll tell you what I take away from this. The first thing is you don't manually have to put in every Microsoft setting, right? Which can be tedious at times. So that's good. The other thing is that when Microsoft revises this baseline and we publish it here to the Security Baseline Center, we have the option to upgrade these profiles, which is a huge deal. Before, what would have happened is you would have gotten a GPO spreadsheet, you would have think that you know what the changes are, and then you would have gone through and maybe made a few changes to your policy and called it a good day. Problem with that is there's a lot of human error that can happen. So we have this change version concept in baselines. I keep mine at the old version just so I can demo this. But if I take this baseline, I can hit change version. I can say, okay, I want to update to the December 2020 baseline, which is the most recent version. And then I have an option to either accept the baseline changes, but keep my existing setting customizations, or accept the baseline changes and discard my existing setting customizations. Now, I don't have to do this wholesale. I can keep or remove my customizations at any time, but I also have this review update button at the top, which allows me to download sort of a CSV that gives me all of the differences between the baseline I currently have deployed and the one that I'm upgrading to, which will save a ton of time, just an absurd amount of time, because you can just filter on the changes. As an IT team, you can go through, okay, there's 3 changes, 1, 2, and 3. Are we going to take these or not? If you don't take them, you add them to your customizations. If you do take them, you leave them alone and you hit submit and you're done. That's it. No more 3 o'clock in the morning, 50,000 lines of spreadsheet trying to figure out which settings need to go out to your enterprise. So that's super important. But our security baseline also gives you unified reporting, and it allows you to configure all these settings in a single profile, which could be capable today with settings catalog now that we're working on releasing it. But in general, this was virtually impossible with the way that we've handled device categories and profiles in the past. You used to have a profile for endpoint protection, a profile for device restrictions, a profile for whatever else, and then you'd sort of try and put them all together and deploy them out as a group. This allows you one single instance to deploy and manage those profiles. So yeah, that's pretty much, I think, all I want to cover here. Yeah, so let's talk about Tenant Attached real quickly. So while I switch back, are there any questions, comments, concerns that we'd want to bring up here?
There are a couple of questions in the chat, it looks like, Matt.
Okay, let's take a look. Of course, Teams does great things like minimizes. Do you know if there's plans to provide a way to extend add new search criteria to create groups so we can target different AV exclusions to different devices? Right now, Intune scoping is very limited. We have plans to enhance grouping and targeting. This is less of a AV exclusions problem and more of a targeting of devices problem. So we'll probably, I don't want to let the cat out of the bag there on anything, but we are looking at ways to make grouping and targeting better. Is there an equivalent of the Windows Security Experience Endpoint Security policy for other OSs? We have a few users running Defender for Endpoint on their Mac OS computers. Not really today. Windows Security Experience is unique in that all of the controls that we typically use, with the exception of EDR, are built into the platform. So we have this sort of need to control the built-in sort of panes and what's there on the Windows platform. With tools like Mac OS, you know, we don't have the same level of customization that we typically need. And for Mac OS in particular, like, we have the controls available to control some of that UX for Defender in the Defender settings, is my understanding. If there's gaps there, I'd love to know about that. We're doing a lot of work in Mac OS right now, so I know the team will be interested to hear that feedback. Please get it to Frank. he can pass it on to me, and I'm happy to make sure that we solve the needs there. But in general, Windows needed a security experience because there were so many platform like components built in that we had to control like the controls, the control panel panes, and the settings panes, and all the built-in pop-ups. And you know, it's not just isolated to Defender AV. You have firewall there. You have exploit protection. You have different ASR scenarios. So it was super important that we had something like Windows Security Experience to control all of that. All right, and that is amazing, Sam. So thanks for calling that out. Okay, so let's talk about sort of what we can do today. So today we have the ability to, let me hold on one second here. I want to make sure I got something. Hold on, this is. Okay, all right, I'm sorry about that. I have a pop-up that showed up and it's telling me that you can't see it, so I'm just going to reshare it. Okay, can everybody see it? Can you just let me know that you see it?
I got it.
Ah, okay, great. Yeah, PowerPoint's like, hey, guy, looks like you're trying to share something. People can't see it. So appreciate it. Okay, so unified endpoint security and management. Okay, so today, this is what we got. We have the ability to manage cloud-only devices, co-managed devices, and cross-platform devices from Intune. We have this new experience called Tenant Attached that we announced at Ignite some time ago, where we built a bunch of functionality where we can start to bring the Configuration Manager value back up into Endpoint Manager as a product, right? So what that means is we have rich data sets on-prem, and we have rich sort of data points on-prem that we want administrators to be able to use in the cloud. So that way they don't have to switch consoles, right? We also don't have a very good help desk experience for Configuration Manager admins today, right? Or for Configuration Manager infrastructures today. We hear from a bunch of customers that, you know, I don't want to give help desk rights to my config man infra. I don't want them to be in the console. It's a ton of consoles to upgrade. Do I virtualize the console? Like, it's a whole thing. So for us, what we've done is we've looked at a few different scenarios. What can we bring up into the configuration, into the Endpoint Manager console that can make sort of the IT ops experience better? And then furthermore, how can we extend our platform coverage in such a way that we can leverage that same channel to deploy endpoint security policy? Because today, the experience is sort of disjointed. Well, it was disjointed before Tenant Attached. You could configure AV policy in MEM and then deploy an anti-malware policy on-prem, and they might have the same settings. They might be different because Configuration Manager releases once every 4 months versus Intune, which releases once every month. And then the Defender team is building settings even faster than that. So it creates sort of like this, I need to set a setting, I got to figure out where to set it thing, right? Which is not a fantastic experience. So for Tenant Attached, from the endpoint security perspective, which is what I'm going to focus on today, there's sort of 4 points. Point number 1, we want you to have the full portfolio of security management controls available on-prem. We don't want you necessarily to be tied to a version of Configuration Manager, limiting your ability to secure your device. And that's sort of where we're going with that. We've done that today with antivirus. We've done it today with tamper protection, and we've done it today with EDR. We're immediately looking to release additional workloads so we can bring that up to parity. That's really one of our goals for the next 6 months. We also don't want your clients to have to connect to the cloud. Well, we feel that connecting to the cloud is going to provide an unparalleled amount of value. We understand that some customers are going to have devices that will not be able to connect to the cloud or be in environments where connecting to the cloud can create substantial business impact. So that's important. And then we want to use what's there today. If you remember what I said before about a single policy pipeline, a single agent, like there's no need for us to have you enroll in a separate service or a separate agent when Configuration Manager can already apply most of this stuff today. And then, of course, endpoint security policy on-prem is awesome, so we should just do that. The other thing that it adds that's not listed here, and I probably should add it to the slide, is that last time I checked, you can't enroll a Windows server. It's just not possible in Intune. So this actually brings Windows Server into the scope of tenant attached policy and into the scope of endpoint security controls, which is really big. So now I can create a single AV policy, target it to a single collection, and then once I target it to a collection, I'm able to just know that the settings are on the device, right? My AV settings, my EDR settings, whatever, they're just there, right? The other thing that we're doing with Windows Server is we're also supporting down to Server 2012 R2. So because we support Server 2012 R2, like we give you an additional platform of coverage, not just a class, but a platform, which is super key. So that's important. It still uses the same controls that we use today on Windows Server. So on 2012 R2, that would be SCEP. On 2016, that would be Defender AV built in and MMA for EDR. And then on 2019, native Defender and Sense built in. So you're still going to use all those controls, but the policy plane will be the same. It'll be the same experience. It'll be managed from the same console. Everything's super easy to handle. Does that all make sense? Hopefully it does. I'm gonna just cover this real quickly in the console, which would be good. I got 13 minutes left and I'm gonna reclaim 2 because Frank had it start late. Sorry, Justin. So what does this look like in the console? So let's just do it because it's super easy. So in the console, this is going to look pretty simple. I'm going to come in here to my antivirus policy, for instance. Today we have them separated out by platform. So today we have Windows 10 and later, and Windows 10 and Windows Server. Our goal is long term is to combine these underneath a single node. But because Tenant Attached is relatively new to the game from policy standpoint, and it's not in every workload, we wanted to break them out in such a way that it was clear to admins what policy they're creating. In the future, you're going to expect to probably see something to the effect of Windows and Windows Server as the platform, and then all of this will just work the same way it does today. We can see Microsoft Defender AV and Windows Security Experience for tamper protection are the 2 profile types that I support in this AV node. So go ahead and create it. When I create the policy with the name test, because you need to be able to track everything, and it's really easy to tell what a policy name test does, I come in here and configure settings, much like I did for my other AV policy, right? The only thing that's going to change is when I actually come here to my assignments pane, I'm going to actually select a collection, right? I'm no longer going to select an Azure AD group. So when I create a collection or I grab a collection, I can just select that collection for the deployment, hit select, and then save this policy, right? This policy will now get targeted to that collection on-prem. What this looks like on-prem is very similar like what a baseline looks like, right? We have a policy pipeline that'll allow Intune to send it through a proxy cloud service that we run, that you attach your infrastructure to. That policy comes down to your service connection point, and then the policy gets created and deployed to the collection. This requires that the user who's creating the policy in the console has the ability to create policy or view Configuration Manager on-prem. We're still bound by the config-man RBAC, and you'll also need to make sure that you have user discovery turned on for Configuration Manager. So that way we can link your on-prem account with this cloud account that you're using, which is really key to making sure you don't break anything. So that's the important part, right? So if I come into Configuration Manager, you're not going to see a lot of the same, right? Or you're not going to see a lot of different. It's going to be mostly the same stuff. Where I'm able to, let me see if I can switch over to my config man console real quick. Where I'm able to, let me just see here. Where did it go? Come here, guy. Okay, here we go. So I'm able to come into my Configuration Manager console, and you're going to be able to see a few different things here from a tenant attached perspective. Now, I have my collection here called TA policy, right? In order to get that policy to show up in the cloud, literally all I need to do is go to the properties of that collection and make sure that it's enabled for targeting, right? So if I come up in here and I go to Cloud Sync, you're going to see a box up top that says make this collection available to assign to endpoint security policies from Endpoint Manager Admin Center, which is obviously a string that maybe marketing hasn't got a hold of. So Checking that box will make it show up in that console. This is super important because a lot of people who are testing this say to me, Matt, I don't want to have all my collections published, or I don't want users to see all my collections, or I don't want, whatever the reason is, I don't want those collections exposed, specifically ones that have large numbers of groups or large numbers of devices, like all desktop and server clients, so on and so forth. So this allows you the flexibility to create specific collections if you'd like and publish those for deploying policy, or select collections that already exist and publish those for policy. So that's important. If I go to my deployments group, what are you going to see? You're going to see a remediation baseline for my TA policy. There's the group right there applied to the device, right? If I go down to the actual client level, you'd be able to see that you'd be able to see it today just like you see any other baseline. This client's actually a server 2008 R2 client. So this is a server 2008 R2 client consuming my policy from the Endpoint Manager Admin Center. Which I think is probably the better example of the power here. So that's important. So before I move on, let me see if there's any other questions in here. Is there any ability to view the Intune policies applied to a group, similar to how we can see licenses or apps in the Azure portal? Today, there's not a clear, concise way to view deployments summarized by groups. It's a piece of feedback that we hear, I'd say, pretty frequently, and I know that we've looked at different ways to do this in the past. Maybe Jason or Frank can take that down as feedback, and we can make sure that we capture that properly. Because you're right, it can be sort of worrisome to do that sometimes. Okay, I only got a few more slides here, I think, so we're gonna wrap up. Let's see here. Okay. And man, you probably smell my mouse burning. I'm clicking in Teams so hard. Okay, so here we go. Let's finish this up here. So cross-platform support. We talked about that very simply, right? Single pane of glass for cross-platform. We want there to be easy onboarding for these platforms. So like Mac OS has the same EDR onboarding capability that that we have for Windows today. We're also trying to make it a first-class citizen in the Mac OS, in the Endpoint Security blade by enhancing the number of policies and configuration knobs that we have for Mac OS and putting those right alongside our Windows platform. We also have MTD support for Android and iOS. Other vendor, I'm not going to try and name one because I'll name two and not the third, and maybe that'll create a whole scenario. But essentially, we allow mobile threat detection vendors. There's a list on our website to plug into our infrastructure and deliver risk signals to us, similar to the way that we do with ATP. So that way, a device's compliance can be judged based on the risk level determined by the MTD vendor, which is super key. It's a little bit different than how a Jamf integration works, but it still gives you a powerful plane to configure. Both are equal in their own right. And then what I just discussed up top, tying that in with device risk, right? So device risk is a device low, medium, or high. We have vendors that can set that risk and then block the device when it's outside of what the organization requires. Yeah, so this is just more of the same. I've talked through all of this. So I guess what I'm going to do now is I'm going to open the floor up for any questions, comments, or concerns that we have. And I'll actually give 5 minutes back if there's no questions. Last thing I'll cover here is this is the sort of experience. I always like showing this slide. I forgot I put it in here. This is the sort of experience I like to highlight, because if you look on the left, you'll see what our threat and vulnerability sort of management experience does. Here are some recommendations of things you need to do, like blocking the use of VLC Media Player version 1 because it's a little bit insecure, and how that looks in endpoint security. Or the SecOps risk up here, a device has been raised to medium because it has 7 active alerts, and that risk immediately being translated to Endpoint Manager for device compliance, right? And then also marrying the two data sets together is just really powerful. Being able to understand, the data points that Endpoint Manager has in the insights that MDE can provide to device behavior, or the MTDs can give to device behavior. Pairing those two data sets together is ridiculously powerful in sort of what I'll call modern security management, or like, you know, everybody likes to configure knobs on a device and understand like what they can restrict. But when you pair like an MTD or you know, a mobile threat defense vendor or a Microsoft Defender for endpoint, when you pair that with a management arm like Endpoint Manager, and you're starting to be able to take insights and turn them into direct action, that's where sort of the modernization for security on endpoints really becomes powerful. For the zero trust story, we like to talk about zero trust all the time, and I talk about it a lot. So that zero trust story and making devices a test, not trust them because at one point they got a driver's license, is super important. You know, and zero trust is like making sure, like taking a driver's test every time you get in your car to prove you can drive, versus getting a driver's license and renewing it once every 7 years, is like how I think about it from a management perspective. So that's key. And then, you know, the insights that we can pair with those things. Yeah, so that being said, that's all I have. So does anybody dare to ask a question via voice, or do we have a bunch of chatters here? Probably chatters, right, Frank? I don't know.
Yeah, we'll see. Maybe we might get some voicers.
Yeah, be useful for me to know if this content was useful, or if there's anything here that you didn't see that you would have liked to seen. So that way I can make sure I'm delivering the right data externally. Just put a thumbs up in the chat if this was useful. If it's not useful, interested in your feedback either in the public forum right now, you just unmute and tell me I'm terrible, or send an email to Frank and let him know sort of what we can do better to position this story if there's any gaps.
Well, I can tell you, for my perspective, very useful, and it's very relevant to the things that my customers are right in the middle of. So the tenant attached story is huge right now, and you know, we're getting a lot of questions about, you know, value add and when to use it, you know, and all of that. So very, very good insights.
Yeah, I mean, we didn't even start to talk about like, okay, I got a few minutes, so I'm going to waste them. Sorry, Frank. It's like we didn't even start to talk about on tenant attached, like let's see if I can, like every impromptu demo, this has a high rate of failure. So let's see what we can do. So like we didn't even start to talk about the other value outside of endpoint security policy management. So if I come to my Windows blade here and just click on a device, let's see here, I have client 01 is, let's find a config man, build 01. If I start looking at build 01 and I start to see my resource explorer and all that stuff start to build out, you talk about things like being able to run CM pivot on a device from the cloud. That scenario is absurdly powerful, because now I'm connected to this device and now I can do things like, I don't know, run the Azure AD status, which pulls out, like, because Jason talked about it before, I'll talk about this sort of object. Azure AD status will actually reach out to the device and pull a lot of the data that's in dsreg command status directly into this console. And if you think about sort of what's happening here, Intune is reaching out to your infrastructure. Your infrastructure is saying, okay, I need to run CM pivot on this device. It reaches out through the BGB channel, or the big green button, or the fast channel, I think is what we're supposed to call it, but it'll always be BGB to me. And through the fast channel, and it's saying, hey device, give me your Azure AD status. And then it's returning all that all the way back up the chain to deliver that back to the console in a relatively small amount of time. Now, I take it that was 40 seconds for a single device. Maybe I don't have the right size VMs here, but I mean, being able to get this sort of data very quickly through tenant attach is a super big value add, right? So that, we have features like, you know, endpoint analytics, which of course are a huge deal, and then timeline, being able to tell like when a device last rebooted, when it synced, when boundary groups changed, things like that, all of that sort of stuff right in here, along with, you know, collections, and just bringing that data up to this layer where I can visualize it and keep people out of the console that don't need to be there. Super useful. So yeah, there, I ended on time.